everyone, I'm the Blood Guy, and welcome back to another review of a serial killer documentary. And yes, as you can tell by the glasses, this is another one on Jeffrey Dahmer. I've actually seen that there's a few on Tubi since we just recently downloaded that. Recently, I reviewed Jeffrey Dahmer Fresh Meat. There is another one I just watched, have all the notes for. I just got to do the review for it. That is Jeffrey Dahmer Killer Cannibal. There's a few more that I plan on doing, a couple more documentaries, and at least 2 films. I've seen all this Dahmer stuff come up, so I figured just go through all of them kind of back to back. This is one I've known about for a while, but have actually never been able to see because I think this is, even though it's on Tubi, I think this is a Oxygen doc, which is actually part of a series because there's also one on Kemper and one on Joe Rifkin, and I believe those two you can only see on Oxygen. For some reason, this one is on Tubi, but it's from 2017. It's one I haven't seen before, but it is Dahmer on Dahmer, A Killer Speaks. Now, when I first heard of this, I kind of thought it was going to be like a compilation of interviews or kind of like Conversations with the Killer on Netflix, but with more audio, kind of delving into his own mind and trying to answer some questions. Not really. What it is it's 2 episodes at 45 minutes, so it's about an hour and a half long. It was directed by, if I can find the director, it actually doesn't even give me the director. And this thing is very slow. I think it's time for a new tablet. Matthew Watts, he's the director. It's hosted by Nancy Glass, who is actually the one that conducted the 1993 Inside Edition interview with Dahmer. And she goes into how she corresponded with Lionel and Sherry for so long, then Dahmer for a year and a half, and then she got to do her interview. And now, how long would it have been? About 14 years later, she's kind of making this documentary. It's I don't really know what she was going for with it, but it does have a lot of captions in the beginning of each one of kind of trying to get inside Dahmer's mind and trying to help Lionel set the record straight for the final time. Because it does have people, like, I think this had the gimmick of being like Lionel Dahmer's final interview, which he would go on to be in the documentary series Mind of a Monster, which I think that's going to be the only like documentary program or series where I'll be reviewing each individual episode. I said I was going to stay away from ones like World's Most Evil Serial Killers, Born to Kill, Most Evil, stuff like that. But Mind of a Monster is like very well made documentaries, and each one kind of feels like a special. So that and A&E might be the only like programs or series that I do reviews for. So Glass is kind of our host and our voiceover narrator, and it kind of sells itself on being like, oh, this will be the final interview with Lionel Dahmer. Get into the mind of a killer through those that knew him best, including myself, Nancy Glass. But also, I think this is the only one I've seen with Sherry, his stepmother, as well. Also, 2 men from the military, Preston Davis and Billy Capshaw, who I believe after this would go on to be in like a 3-day Dahmer special on Dr. Phil. I believe this is the first time they appeared in something talking about their time in the military and their assault on them by Dahmer. Those are really kind of the only nuances that this brings. It does have other people that's appeared in a bunch of Dahmer documentaries. Most notably, his neighbor Pamela Bass, but also the prosecutor Michael McCann, the forensic psychiatrist for the prosecution, Dr. Park Dietz, the forensic psychiatrist for the defense, Dr. Fred Berlin, a homicide detective named Dennis Murphy, Dahmer's attorney for his 1988 trial, Gerald Boyle. These are all people that's been in a bunch of different documentaries. Even Mike Kukral, if I pronounce that correctly, uh, who's a classmate of Dahmer's, he appeared in Fresh Meat. I believe it was. It was either Fresh Meat or Killer Cannibal. I believe it was Fresh Meat. He appeared in that. So it has a bunch of familiar faces as well. A ton of dramatizations. Uh, in fact, I think in between like high school and his arrest, there's not really many photos or footage, save for like the two clips of home videos that everyone has seen, like Thanksgiving Day 1990 when he's petting the cat or flipping through the magazine. And yeah, it does kind of go chronologically, like all the stuff from when he was a kid, the animals, his antics in high school, and his alcoholism. Stephen Hicks, his first victim. It doesn't really do much for the victims at all. Uh, it does show this graphic timeline where we see their photo. Some of them don't even have exact dates, just month and year in their name. Some of them are just rattled right off. Like, I think some of them it'll just rattle like two or three off up in a row, not talk about them really at all. And I feel like he's trying to answer the questions of what made Jeffrey Dahmer this way, what kind of killer is he, and it does kind of give an answer, or at least Lionel Dahmer's answer as to why he thinks Jeff was the way he was and why he did the things he did, which it saves for the very end. So I'm actually not going to mention it here. I'll leave that for the end of my notes when I go through that. But what this feels like is, and I'm very glad to have found someone who was selling a bootleg of this because this is my favorite Jeffrey Dahmer documentary. But Conversations with the Killer, Jeffrey Dahmer tapes on Netflix. It kind of feels like a very condensed version of this because the whole all the audio and video is from essentially the same interview, the Nancy Glass Inside Edition. It does have some audio of like with him talking to a psychologist or part of his confession, but it's mostly the Glass interview. And the interview is used to kind of set up the next segment or to add context to what some of the talking heads have been saying. Similar to this, like how all the audio is from the 60 hours of his confession. It's used in a very similar way. It kind of goes chronologically through his life, talking about the same things over and over and over again. Only this one is one, it's half the runtime, but really the only new things it adds, I felt, were the two gentlemen that he served in the military with, them coming forward, and the fact that Sherry was in it, because I don't think I've seen her in another documentary. I know that she was in the Dr. Phil special, but the interview with Dr. Phil was actually filmed like so many years prior. It was just being shown during that special. And some of the stuff that Lionel says, like him going into Jeff's death, uh, his reasoning for why Jeff did the things that he did. But other than that, I mean, it does kind of just feel like a very, very condensed version of this. And I mean, it wasn't bad. It wasn't boring. I mean, it did kind of go at a good pace, especially episode 2. I thought episode 2 went by really quick. It is broken up into segments, which I do think kind of helped break it down a lot. I have read some interviews that this just felt super sensational, and it just felt kind of like Nancy Glass trying to get another Dahmer piece out there, which I can kind of see. I mean, that kind of makes sense. It's nowhere near as good as this, but I mean, it's still I mean, with Jeffrey Dahmer, he's one of those killers that any true crime enthusiast, if something's made on him, we're gonna watch it. As redundant as it is, I mean, a lot of the things said and explored in this has been done at nauseum. It's not the most original, save for maybe a couple of the interviews, a couple of the things that they say. But other than that, it's a lot of the same familiar faces, familiar topics, the same sort of psychological breakdowns from some of the people, like Dr. Berlin, Dr. Dietz, uh, Prosecutor McCann. Uh, it's not as dramatization heavy as some of the other ones I've seen. It's still competently made. I mean, I, I would probably still say that the worst Dahmer documentary would probably still have to be Fresh Meat. So it's still better than that. But and yeah, it definitely doesn't really do much for the victims at all. Uh, I do wonder how this compares to Kemper on Kemper and Rifkin on Rifkin. But like I said, I would have to get the oxygen service for that. So this does kind of feel like yet another Jeffrey Dahmer documentary. Uh, I would say I still haven't seen one quite as original or warranting its existence aside from this, other than, say, the Jeffrey Dahmer files or the intent to Fresh Meat was good, but the execution wasn't that great. The other one that I watched and still have to review, Killer Cannibal, it it goes quite in depth on a psychological angle. You know, like there was actually a few things I learned in that, which I was surprised by. But this really does just kind of feel like an extension or expansion of this, just kind of a way to further elaborate on some of the stuff Jeff said in that interview with a lot of the familiar faces. But I still thought it was I don't know if enjoyable is the right word, but you know, I was never bored. I was never just kind of all right, the same topic, keep going. Uh, I've at least enjoyed every Dahmer documentary I've seen, so it was still worth my time. I might have been a couple things where I was like, oh, okay, that wasn't quite what I thought it was, or oh, that like which actually Killer Cannibal had a couple tiny, tiny, tiny details, like just some tiny facts, like the reason why he used handcuffs on Tracy Edwards was actually because he was out of Halcyon. You know, just small details like that, things that hadn't really been said. Uh, it does have footage of his Ohio trial, which was after the one in Milwaukee when he was being tried for Stephen Hicks. I don't think I've seen any footage from that in any documentary. So it does have a little tiny bit of nuance. Again, some of the stuff Lionel says, Sherry being in it, the two gentlemen he served in the military with. But and those are some of the things that the documentary really sells itself on, but is very minimal. Like the two guys in the military combined might have 5 minutes worth. It doesn't really go into much, but it's still a worthwhile documentary. That's the best I can say. Not bad, not boring, not you know full of a lot of misinformation, which I've seen before. So I would say the thing about Dahmer is even if it's a solid documentary, there's so many of them that it's kind of easy to kind of get lost in the ether of Dahmer, which is why I've always said that like this and the Jeffrey Dahmer files are like two of the best ones. But with that, that is Dahmer on Dahmer. So I guess we'll get into the brief summary, and then hopefully it's not as long as others. It should be, but the list of notes of what the two episodes cover. Jeffrey Dahmer, aka the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster, is one of the most notorious serial killers in history. Between June 1978 and July 19th, 1991, Dahmer murdered 17 young men and boys, ranging in age from 14 to 33. After being lured to his home, he would drug his victims, strangle them, take Polaroids, practice necrophilia, and then dismember them, keeping body parts around his apartment, such as skulls, whole heads, skeletons, hands, genitalia, and even stored their meat for consumption. His crimes were a gradual progression. He didn't practice necrophilia right away, and he did not engage in cannibalism until his 8th victim, Ernest Miller, and starting with his 11th victim, Errol Lindsay, he would drill into their skulls and pour acid or hot water into their brain, hoping to render them into submissive sex zombies. Dahmer was born in Milwaukee on May 21st, 1960, to chemist Lionel Dahmer and a stay-at-home mother, Joyce. His brother David was born when Jeff was 6. As a child in the Bath Township of Ohio, Jeff was known to be emotionally distant, withdrawn, and only showing interest in collecting and dissecting roadkill and other dead animals. He was a teen alcoholic shortly after realizing he was gay and having no one to talk to about it, and enduring his parents' constant fights. And he was a class clown and graduated high school in 1978. It was that summer Dahmer's parents finally divorced, and he claimed his first victim, 18-year-old Stephen Hicks, who was a hitchhiker. He then had short stints at Ohio State, the Army, and living in Miami, all cut short due to his drinking. From 1981 until 1990, Jeff lived with his grandmother, Catherine, in West Allis, Wisconsin. During this time, Dahmer worked at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory, starting in 1985. Then he discovered the gay bars and was soon blacklisted from the gay bathhouses for drugging and leaving the men there after his assault on them. This led to him taking men to hotels, and it was at the Ambassador Hotel he killed his second victim, Stephen Tuomi, on either September 15th or November 20th, depending on the source, of 1987. This is what kicked off his official murder spree. He was arrested for numerous sex-related crimes in 1981 for drunken disorderly conduct, 1982 for indecent exposure at a Wisconsin fair, 1986 for lewd and lascivious behavior for masturbating in the presence of two 12-year-old boys, and again in 1988 for luring a 13-year-old to pose for photographs. While living at his grandmother's, he killed 3 more young men. After moving into the Oxford apartments in 1990, he killed 12 more victims and began his cannibalism and making his macabre abattoir. One of his victims at this time, 13-year-old Laotian boy, Konrad Sentasophone, which was on May 27th, 1991, was actually the younger brother of the boy Dahmer molested in his 1988 charge. On July 22nd, 1991, his to-be 18th victim, Tracy Edwards, escaped his apartment and flagged down police. When they got back to apartment 213, they found his Polaroids and a head in the refrigerator, immediately arresting him. This led to a media explosion, and Dahmer became one of the most infamous killers. He was found guilty of 16 of the 17 murders and sentenced to 999 years. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer and fellow inmate Jesse Anderson were beaten to death by another inmate, Christopher Scarver. In the years since his arrest and death, there have been countless documentaries, books, films, and even a comic book made about him. Jeffrey Dahmer-related artifacts have become some of the most sought-after murderabilia. And so we'll go into what the documentary actually goes into. So 2 episodes, neither one has a title, just episode 1, episode 2. Episode 1 opens up with footage of Dahmer giving his final statement in court, put to these big cinematic captions. Like 25 years ago, America's most notorious serial killer was brought to justice, and so on. Like, get into the psyche of a madman. Victims speak up for the first time. Unprecedented access to the people who knew him. A father's first interview in over a decade. The evolution of a psychopath. Straight from the killer's mouth. And this is all put to stuff that we're going to see. Like, interview with Lionel and Sherry. 2 guys in the military who actually also appeared on Dr. Phil. I believe I believe the Dr. Phil special was after this, but so kind of sets everything up. So we get footage of the initial news story, like people taking everything out of the Oxford apartments. We're introduced to Nancy Glass, who's kind of our host, but also our voiceover narrator. She was the one from Inside Edition that did the 1993 interview with Dahmer. She goes into how the story broke, how she wanted the story. She reached out to his parents, corresponded with Jeff himself for about a year and a half, then the actual interview, how he appeared so normal, and that was frightening. Then we got some footage of their interview stating that he had a good childhood, no abuse, and can't pinpoint any certain event that made him the way he was. And as I've said before, it's structured very similarly to Conversation with the Killer, the Jeffrey Dahmer tapes, in that all the audio from Dahmer comes from the one source, which would be the Nancy Glass interview, and it's used to kind of set up a segment or add context to a segment. So I put all those as well each time it comes up. So then it's broken up into eras. So like part one is childhood years, 1960s. Dr. Fred Berlin, who is a forensic psychiatrist and the key witness for the defense. He goes into how no one thing makes someone a serial killer, though many experience some trauma, but Jeff never did. It goes into his early childhood life, his home. We're introduced to Lionel and Sherry, how Joyce took 27 pills a day, wouldn't let people hold Jeff. She rarely held him. She was afraid of germs. Goes into the birth of David, how that affected Dahmer, kind of like, well, you wouldn't hold me, now you're holding David. I'm kind of left out. How the move when he was 6 might have traumatized him a bit. It doesn't at all go into his double hernia surgery, which Lionel has always talked about. And then, of course, his interest in animal carcasses and roadkill. We get audio of Jeff with a psychologist about finding a dead beagle and putting its head on a stick. It did show a photo of it, which there is a photo of it. We're introduced to Dr. Martha Schmidt, who's a sociologist but was also a classmate of Dahmer's, on Jeff's high school behavior, and at one time asking him why he acted crazy, and he said he liked to shake people up. We're introduced to Mike Cockrell, if I pronounce that correctly, who's another classmate of Dahmer's, on his antics, sneaking into yearbook photos. It shows the blacked out of Honor Society photo. They both go into his drinking, and then it goes into how drinking possibly covered up his growing fantasies. We get a clip of the Glass interview about his fantasies. So then we go into Dark Fantasies, spring 1976. It goes into the fantasy of the jogger, and then eventually how Dahmer eventually went to go stop the jogger, subdue him, then bring him home, but the jogger never came by. Dr. Park Dietz, who was a witness for the prosecution, he's been in a few serial killer cases. I believe he was also Arthur Shawcross. He goes into the jogger and Jeff's fantasies. Michael McCann, who was the prosecutor, on how he didn't know how to start a real relationship. So he'd watch until he waited in the bushes, but then the jogger never showed up. It goes into his graduation, Lionel and Joyce's divorce, him being left alone in the home after Joyce left, Sherry on him being left alone in the house with no money or food, and this being the time she came into the Dahmer family by dating Lionel. It goes into the abandonment he probably felt at that time, a clip from the Glass interview, knowing what he did was wrong, and then going into the first murder and his hitchhiker fantasy. So then we go to victim number 1, June 18th, 78. Yeah, I noticed this documentary kind of limits the victims to numbers. It doesn't really go into the victims as people or human beings. Some of them, they do kind of regulate to just numbers. This being one of them. So victim number 1, June 18th, 78, Stephen Hicks, hitchhiker on his way to a rock concert. We get a photo of him. We're introduced to Lynn Slabby, who was a prosecutor of Summit County, Ohio, and Dennis Murphy, who's a homicide detective on the murder of Stephen Hicks. It goes into how he wasn't wearing a shirt while he was hitchhiking. And it was when he said he had to leave that Dahmer panicked and attacked. We're introduced to Gerald Boyle, but he's credited as Jerry Boyle, which I don't think I've ever seen that before. Who was Dahmer's attorney in the 1988 case of child molestation. On how if he was straight, he'd probably done the same thing to women. It goes into his pullover by police and his manipulation skills. Sherry on Jeff living with them at the Dahmer home, his drinking escalating, taking him to get help, but it never worked. Him failing out of Ohio State. Schmidt on the last time she saw him, which was also at Ohio State, passed out drunk outside. Lionel on encouraging him to enlist in the Army. Parts of the Glass interview, which during the 9-year period, there was no opportunity to do what he wanted. Then it says, for years it was believed he didn't do anything during that 9-year window from between his first and second victims. And then it says, until now. Because then we go into the military, which was January of 79 to March of 81. When these two men, Preston Davis and Billy Capshaw, have finally come forward to talk about their the assaults that they endured by Dahmer, which I don't think had ever been known, at least until this came out. Again, I think this did come out before the Dr. Phil special. But we're introduced to Preston Davis, who was on a 2-week exercise in Baumholder, Germany. And then during the last few days, he was drugged and assaulted by Dahmer. He goes into how he went downhill after that. He got a DWI in 85, left military and divorced in 86, became estranged from his son, and continued substance and alcohol abuse. Says it's common amongst these kinds of victims to do that. They were introduced to Billy Capshaw, who is Dahmer's bunkmate in Baumholder, Germany. He actually replaced Preston Davis when he left, because I think Davis left after that exercise. He goes into how he'd wake up and Dahmer would have him naked, tied or cuffed to a bunk. Dahmer would be naked next to him, cuddling him. Says how he was sexually assaulted and tortured, and how shame kept him quiet, because he says, all these guys are mean, they have guns. Why would you, at a 17-year-old, say that some guy raped you? So that really messed with him, and that's why he never came out and said anything. Photos of both of them from that period. It says how it's odd Dahmer was so open about everything, but not these particular incidents, which opens up the question, why and what else is there? So he's discharged March of 81 for drinking. It does show his, I'm guessing they're called discharge papers. It does show those on screen. Lionel on his disappointment, which I think at this point all he knew was that the constant failures were due to drinking. He didn't know about the assaults or anything else. Sherry on sending him to counseling and eventually to grandma's. How he went to church to hopefully cure him of his homosexuality. How he worked at a blood bank. His arrest for exposure to women and children at a fair. It shows his 1982 mugshot, which was not his first arrest. He was first arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct in the previous year. So then Dr. Park Dietz on his attempts to find a substitute partner that would lay still, be submissive, and he would be able to dominate. It mentions 2 attempts to grave rob. I always knew of one attempt. I've always only read one attempt, which was that of the motorcyclist that died. Then he goes into the mannequin. It mentions how Grandma found and disposed of it. I always heard that it was Lionel. Like, she found it, called Lionel, then he disposed of it. And from some of the interviews I heard, Dahmer had even said he wasn't sure which one got rid of it, but he believes it was Lionel. Then it goes into the bathhouses, drugging and assaulting men, uh, the one overdose that he caused. The guy lived, but he caused an overdose. Then him being banned from bathhouses. So then we go into the next part, which is the spree begins. Now it says November 20th of '87, and as I've said before in some of these Dahmer pieces, that sources penned on the murder of Stephen Toomey either September 15th of '87 or November 20th of '87. Uh, this one went with November 20th. But get a bit of the Glass interview speaking of the Ambassador Hotel and Stephen Toomey. Dahmer saying, he had no intention of hurting him. He drugged him. When he woke up, he was bruised, cracked rib. He had beaten him to death, but he had no memory of it. Dr. Berlin on how Jeff told him that this wasn't premeditated and he had to find a way to dispose of it, and that he believed him. How he smuggled the body out and disposed of him. He went out, got a suitcase, came back, put him in the suitcase, brought him back to Grandma's, then disposed of him the next day while she was at church. Glass interview on his obsession growing, and it was out of the desire to keep his victims with him and eventually saving body parts. So it very, very briefly mentions 14-year-old James Dockstader and 23-year-old Richard Guerrero. It shows a graphic timeline for all these murders. It just, it literally mentions 14-year-old James Dockstader and 23-year-old Richard Guerrero in January and March of '88. That's all it says about those two. So that, it does say they were drugged, strangled, dismembered, how Grandma complained about the smell. Sherry on Lionel being too naive because she would send Lionel to go fix and help complaints that she had. Lionel on how he was told and believed that it was his roadkill experiments, because of course he did that in high school. And how it's time to finally move out of Grandma's. So this is all put to a whole video of Jeff at Grandma's as he's petting the cat on the floor. So then, on his own, September of '88, his first apartment. After one day, he's arrested for the assault on 13-year-old Sobsak Syntosophone, or Syntosophone, Synthosomphone. I've heard a few different pronunciations. It shows a photo of him, but it's one that often gets used as a photo for Konarak, his brother, which is the one with the shorter hair and glasses. I always thought that was Sobsak, but a lot of documentaries use that as a photo of Konarak. But there is a bit of audio from court testimony saying that it's Sobsak. Now, I don't know if this is a recreation or actual audio, because it doesn't say. Gerald Boyle on not believing he was a killer at that time. How then he goes into how in between his conviction in January and sentencing in March, he still killed again. So it goes into 24-year-old Anthony Sears, his fifth victim, on March 25th of '88. Shows him on the timeline. Glass interview on Sears being the victim whose head was mummified and kept, and also kept in his locker at work. Boyle on the outcome of the assault trial, how he did believe Dahmer about touching the boy, but believed that the sentence was appropriate for what they knew about him at the time, which was only a year with a work release. So, how Lionel urged the judge to get Jeff psychiatric help, but how that didn't work, and Jeff's remorseful letter to the judge, which it shows and reads how he had fooled psychiatrists and probation officers. He's released and put on probation, which it doesn't mention the year sentence and a work release. So then it goes into the next chapter, which is Apartment 213. May 1990, which is when he moved in. Pamela Bass on being his neighbor and friend, even trying to hook him up with a female friend, but him saying he just wanted to work and be left alone. Mitch's 23-year-old Raymond Smith showed on the timeline, who was also in May. He was drugged, strangled, dismembered. The following month, 27-year-old Edward Smith, clip of the Glass interview on Jeff talking about his routine of going out, meeting someone, offering them money, coming back, spiking their drink, which he already had the crushed pill there and ready, then strangled them in their sleep. Dr. Berlin and Dr. Dietz on how he chose his victims, men he was attracted to, and that was willing to accompany him voluntarily, so ones that he was able to lure. And how he wanted men that would lie still, but he had so many men previously that either were mean to him, were not into that, possibly rob him. So I think that was when I think that they're implying that's when the drugging started, and even way back in the bathhouses before Stephen Tuomi. Glass interview on how Dahmer saying that if you depersonalize victims, it made everything easier, and wondering why he doesn't have more dreams or nightmares about his murders. It's almost like it's been blocked out of his mind. So that's episode 1. It's now become to part 2, which again has no title, just called part 2. It opens up with the captions, and this is all put to trial footage. Summer of 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer's body count is at 7 victims and rising. Despite close calls, the murders escalate. How did no one notice? Explore the evolution of pure evil. Return to the most in-depth interview Dahmer ever gave. In his own words, with the journalists who knew him best. New revelations of those closest to the case. Some speaking for the first time in over 20 years. A father tries to set the record straight for a final time. It's also all put to footage of the Nancy Glass Inside Edition interview and things we'll see later on. But I thought it was a nice touch. Some people might say a little exploitative. But there's a quick montage of all the talking head interviewees, rapid cut, saying things about Dahmer like cannibalism, necrophilia, head in the fridge, vats of acid, all these different things. And then it ends with Sherry saying, but he was our son. Thought it was a nice touch, but some people might say a little sensational or exploitative. So let me go back to Nancy Glass on her interview with Dahmer. Shows a clip of him saying how at that time killing was kind of addictive. It gave him a surge of energy. So then we cut back to Dr. Dietz on necrophilia being more than just dead bodies, but control and dominance for as long as you want, and someone that won't judge or leave you. Michael McCann on not doubting that Dahmer disliked murder, which Dahmer always said, but he liked sex with compliant partners and would do anything to get it, so that goes along with Dahmer saying how it's sort of a means to an end. Dietz on how he hated the dismembering process, so he was always drinking during, which I always thought that the dismemberment was part of the fantasy. That was something he enjoyed. Maybe it was the disposal of the bodies and the parts that he hated, which, if he did hate the dismemberment process, then that's yet another parallel with Dennis Nielsen, which I've been meaning to make a video comparing and contrasting Dahmer and Nielsen. Clip of the Glass interview of how the compulsion overpowered any revulsion he may have felt, how he was extremely selfish and only thought of himself and his desires. So then we go to September 1990. 22-year-old dance student Ernest Miller, he's shown on the timeline, met outside a bookstore. He's brought back, strangled. His skeleton was stored in a filing cabinet, and his heart and biceps were stored in the freezer. It doesn't mention how he's the first to be cannibalized, or how, how it was the bicep that was the first that he ate. 3 weeks later, 22-year-old David Thomas, he's shown on the timeline. It doesn't mention how nothing of Thomas was kept. I've seen other interviews where it says how he brought him back, and then that's when he learned he wasn't really attracted to him. So he killed him anyway because he'd already drugged him and just threw him out. So it doesn't mention how he didn't save anything of him. Clip of the Glass interview, the photos being his way of remembering their appearance, and it goes into his altar, which it shows his drawing of his altar. McCann on the altar, not being a symbol or place of religion or ritual, but just rather where Dahmer can sit and look at and remember all the people that he's killed. Glass interview on how cannibalism started as a curiosity and then a compulsion, and how he felt that consuming them would make them a part of him. Deets on how, contrary to what people think, he didn't have meat everywhere and just like go into like a feeding frenzy. He would have like a fillet of bicep or whatever that make a meal of it. Which Dahmer did say that he only consumed about 10 to 12 pounds worth of meat of his victims. So far less than what people think when it comes to Dahmer. Like, they probably think it's like some Chainsaw Massacre type thing where he's just got meat hanging everywhere and he's just kind of like a rabid animal. Similar to like Gacy, people think of Killer Clown that he's like Pennywise or something, but that wasn't the case either. One of those aspects of Dahmer that's kind of taken a life of its own. So let me go into the chapter called The Double Life. Glass interview on how he was able to go to work and compose himself, the home security that he installed, and how the keepsakes were always locked away. Though in Killer Cannibal, it talked about how he painted his skulls, one, because he wanted to, but two, because they kind of looked fake and plastic. That way he could leave them all around, and people would think they were fake, and he could show them to other people. Which, Killer Cannibal, it kind of lengthy, and there's a lot to talk about. That will be another documentary review that I'll be doing. I actually watched that prior to this one. It shows home video footage of Thanksgiving Day, 1990. I think that's the home video footage everyone has seen, where he's sitting there flipping through the magazine, talking about how he's been eating McDonald's but has to eat at home more, which has a creepy connotation now. Sherry on going to his apartment and never seeing any evidence of anything. Lionel comes in, and then the voiceover says that this will be the final time he's talking about his son. Even though this came out in 2017, and he did appear in Mind of a Monster in 2020, I'm guessing at that time he thought it would be his final time. But Lionel, wishing he pushed harder to find things out, because Jeff was so secretive, and then Sherry again talking about how naive Lionel was. It mentions how, despite all of this, it was not known to Milwaukee that a serial killer was loose. McCann on how it was normal for young men to just up and leave or run away for various reasons, and then return a few weeks later. So it was very different and very lax investigation tactics back then. He even says it very different from if a woman goes missing. So we go to February of 91, 17-year-old Curtis Strouder. He's shown on the timeline, lured from a bus stop. His next and his 11th victim would be the next stage of his obsession, it says, which brings us to the chapter called Zombies. April of 91, Dr. Berlin says Dahmer was aroused by dead bodies, but also zombies, which is something in between alive and dead, and that's something that he would act on. So then it goes into his 11th victim, Errol Lindsay. He's shown on the timeline. But then it immediately says he fails again in May of 91 with Tony Hughes. But at this point, it still doesn't say what the zombie experiment is or was, or what he was trying to do. So I don't know if that's just like for build-up, saying he did it to Lindsay, then failed again with Hughes. But so I don't know if that was just for build-up because it hadn't said what it was yet. But then there's a clip of the Glass interview on what the zombie experiment was. And when asked if he could be stopped, he says no, because he was so already dead set against satisfying the compulsion. But yeah, the clip is of Dahmer saying he'd drill into their skull, pour some sort of dilute acid solution into the hole, into their brain, or hot water, hoping to render them completely submissive, almost like a backyard lobotomy, how it never worked. But then there's also audio of Jeff with the forensic psychologist on drilling into their brain. How his third zombie attempt would lead to his closest call yet, which then brings us into the audio of the phone call of May 27th, 91, from Nicole Childress about Conrad sent the cell phone. I don't know why that name is always so hard for me to say. Especially after how many times I've said it throughout all these videos. But yeah, so it goes into Conrack, how he was picked up, and you know how he got the zombie experiment. He escaped. The police came. There was Nicole Childress, who's the niece of Glenda Cleveland, and then Glenda Cleveland's daughter, Sandra, I believe her name was. And then how the police didn't believe them and pretty much gave Conrack back. There's also Pamela Bass saying how she saw a young boy bleeding going down the hall. It does go into, McCann says there was no way the cops could have known that he'd been drilled into his head. Like, they just thought he was drunk, even though other sources say that he had been bleeding from the head. Mentions how the police even brought Conrack inside the apartment, didn't really look around, mentions how Tony Hughes' body was still inside. And then we get audio of their call to dispatch with their laughter, and briefly goes into sort of their if their prejudice had any kind of role in how they treated the situation, which McCann says that saying yes, there was prejudice and that's why they acted the way they did. He said that was too harsh of a judgment for him to say. Clip of the Glass interview on his reaction to the police being inside during that time. It shows Conrack on the timeline, and then very, very quickly, Matt Turner in June and Jeremiah Weinberger in July of 91, and then 10 days later, Oliver Lacey. Doesn't really say anything about them, they kind of just pop up on the timeline. Pamela Bass on the smell and helping him clean his apartment, mentions his eviction, getting fired from the chocolate factory for missing work. 2 days after Lacey, 25-year-old Joseph Bradoff, he's shown on the timeline, will be his final victim, which was July 19th. And so then we go into the arrest, which was July 22nd of 91. Pamela Bass kind of talking about that night, hearing that she could hear that Jeff had company over. Shows a photo of Tracy Edwards. Mentions how he was out of Halcyon, so he used a handcuffs, but he could only get one cuff on the wrist. It shows footage of Edwards on the stand. It does mention of Exorcist 3 and how that was part of his a ritual, and he would watch it every time he would go out to find a victim, which I've also seen in interviews and read that he would watch it every day anyway. Clip of the Glass interview saying how he felt evil and gained pleasure from watching it, but he did enjoy feeling evil. The footage of Edwards of how he escaped. Police finding Polaroids in a drawer. It does show the evidence photo of the drawer with all the Polaroids, but they're all blurred out. No mention of while the cops finds the Polaroid, the other one looks in the fridge and finds the head, and then that's when they go to arrest him. I've heard both, that one cop found one found the other, and then they decided to cuff and arrest him. And then I've read, and most commonly, that it was just the photos that they found, and then the head was found later on when they really searched the apartment. So then it goes in. It immediately shows the news footage immediately after the arrest and once everything had been going on, like all the evidence being taken out. Shows evidence photos of the apartment. Voiceover says some of the things that were found, like skeletons, skulls, 57-gallon drum of acid and torsos, neatly wrapped meat in the fridge. Glass interview clip of the night of the arrest and giving up trying to hide and just give a confession. So we go into the confession, which was the next day, July 23rd. Dennis Murphy on first meeting Dahmer in his confession, starting at the beginning, which now it shows a completely different timeline. It shows where all the victims are at that point. It goes into the notion that Dahmer may have a type, since 10 of the 17 victims were black. Shows a clip of the Glass interview that he wasn't racially motivated. It was all about finding the most attractive person possible. So we go to Gerald Boyle saying the only time he ever saw Dahmer get mad was when it was implied that he was racially motivated, and him actually believing that Dahmer was not driven by race. Sherry saying that they didn't know the extent of his crimes until they saw it in the papers and on the news. Lionel on how they tried to keep it from Grandma. She was still shocked, but she didn't know the extent of it. And by the time someone did tell her, she had already succumbed to dementia. And how we wanted to go to trial to have Jeff studied as to find out the whys as to why he did what he did, but it was useless. They couldn't figure anything out. And Lionel saying that he believes that the true reason was lack of connection with our creator. So then we go into the insanity trial, which began January 30th of 92. How they're going to trial for insanity with the hopes that he'll get treated at a hospital, and hopefully find out why. Sherry on bringing him a suit to court. Lionel on having to listen to the details, and again, the reason he did the things he did was because he was not with God. Clip of the Glass interview about why he didn't wear his glasses in court, and it was so he wouldn't have to look at anybody in the face. He could just kind of further disassociate. It shows quite a bit of trial footage, goes into how he was found sane. The only impact statement they show is, of course, Rita Isbell, the sister of Errol Lindsay, when she blows up at him. But then we go to the Glass interview of Dahmer's reaction to that blow up, saying that he doesn't blame her. footage of his final statement, and then how he was given 15 life sentences, equaling 936 years. And then I haven't seen too much of this, but when he was extradited to Ohio, and it shows footage of the Ohio trial for Stephen Hicks, given another life sentence. And it says how he wasn't tried or convicted of Stephen Tuomi because he was blacked out, no body, no evidence to link him to the murder. So that's the only one that he was not convicted of. Pamela Bass on how he wanted her to come visit him in prison, but at that point she was terrified of him. She says how Jeff was her friend across the hall, Dahmer was someone else, and he scared her. Clip of the Glass interview with how he sleeps all day, wakes for meals, and then stays up all night, trying to avoid daylight, but also memories of his crimes. Lionel and Sherry on how they visited him in prison, and Sherry really tried for all of them to still be a strong family despite him being in prison. Clip of the Glass interview of him saying how it's best for everyone that he's in prison, and then it goes into how he found God, found religion. We're introduced to Roy Ratcliffe, who was Dahmer's a minister, which actually I think he even says that Dahmer was his first baptism in prison. So he goes into how he got the call saying Dahmer wanted to be baptized, and how he wanted to do it to be right with God. Lionel on how Jeff found God and how he ordered a bunch of books, and how he converted. Clip of the Glass interview on how no one believed his conversion and he wouldn't believe it either if he were them, but how Christ will be his final judge anyway. Sherry on bringing one of the victim's sisters, she didn't say which one, but bringing a sister in to visit Jeff. He explained to her how he died, and even how she forgave him, and how that was a big deal for Jeff. A clip of the Glass interview on how he deserves death, the death penalty, thoughts about suicide, but he can't do it because now that he found God, suicide's the ultimate sin. But then the final chapter is November 28th of 94. Montage, news reports of his death. We get a quick clip of Scarver and how he was beaten to death by Christopher Scarver with the barbell, which was ironic or fitting because that's what he used on Stephen Hicks. Lionel on Jeff's death and seeing his body. Lionel and Sherry on forgiveness and him being with God. And then during the end credits, we go back to that former classmate, Schmidt, on how Dahmer is essentially the definition of evil. So that's 2017's Dahmer on Dahmer. And yeah, I still do think it feels kind of like a condensed version of Conversations with the Killer, the Jeffrey Dahmer tapes. It does kind of go into the same information that's been gone over ad nauseum at this point. It does kind of have some nuances, though. It does provide some new stuff to it, like whether it be some newer things with Lionel and Sherry, even having Sherry as part of the documentary. The two men he served in the military with, them coming forward, that's new. Granted, as very small as their part is, it does kind of feel like they're attempting to answer questions that's always been asked, but it really does just kind of feel like an extended version of Nancy Glass's Inside Edition interview with Dahmer. It feels like that interview, but with a bunch of context around it, cutting from the interview and getting all this context around it. Doesn't really go into the victims at all. Some of the victims, they just get their name, age, and the date they were killed. That's about it. So it doesn't really answer anything or shed much light on anything, but like anything on Dahmer, it's still a very interesting watch. I feel like episode 2 went by very, very quick. It does have some newer footage, some newer photos, Um, I'm not sure how how well this Schmidt lady really knew Dahmer. It felt like just she might have been the only one that was willing to be in a documentary about him. But yeah, especially watching all these documentaries back to back, it does feel like just another one that's just kind of going over the same story again and again. But yeah, it doesn't really answer anything. Even some of the stuff Lionel says is some of the same stuff he's always said. But there is some new stuff that he says as well. But uh, uh, at the end of the day, it does kind of just feel like an expansion or extension of uh, Nancy Glass's 1993 interview with Dahmer. But I still found it very interesting, nonetheless. Still, it's not the most well made, but uh, I would actually say I enjoyed this more than the last Dahmer one I did, which was Fresh Meat, which was a Tubi original. But that is Dahmer on Dahmer. If I want to see Kemper on Kemper and Rifkin on Rifkin, I'll have to get the uh, Oxygen streaming service, which is kind of pricey. But there is going to be a few more Dahmer pieces that I'll be reviewing just because there's a lot available now. At least one or two more documentaries and then two films that I'll be doing. So stay tuned for those, and thank you for watching.